All right, so as I said, a brief introduction, continuing from the points that I'd made on Tuesday, and then very briefly talk about women in India first, before we move to the question of women, South Asian women in the diaspora, beginning in, let's say, the late 19th century, moving into the nationalist period, and then and then shifting our focus to the diasporic context, particularly the United States. I'm also going to discuss a couple of websites, including this one over here. I don't want you to think about this right now. Shadi.com, there are many sites of this kind. These are matrimonial sites. When I first taught this class about 15 years ago, this particular Shadi.com was just coming up, but they didn't have an online presence really. You had to really go to newspapers such as India West, where you would see these ads. So to access some of this, I had to actually register myself, although I'm not looking for anyone, but to really access some of the ads. But we won't have time to really get into these in great detail. I just want to give you an idea. Let me take you back to the 19th century. And also, by the way, let me add before I forget that I will be returning papers to you at the end of class today, and I'm going to take about 15-20 minutes to talk about the papers and a number of issues related not so much to how you write papers, but issues related to the papers themselves. That is, and much of that has to do with the subject of today's lecture as well. So let's shift back our focus to the 19th century. Recall what I mentioned to you in my previous lecture, that there are two principal considerations you need to think about. The first is that in the early 19th century, for various reasons, one of which is the inclination that we still have, and that is to rank countries and rank civilizations, right? So I mentioned to you that if you take an organization such as UNDP, United Nations Development Program, one of the things that UNDP does is it ranks and evaluates countries, and it uses various kinds of indices, such as what is the level of literacy in a country, right? And what is the point of this? You could say the point of it is to embarrass the countries at the bottom end of the scale, that, well, you need to improve yourself. You could say there are many other, that this is simply gives us an idea of how people are doing in certain countries. What is the standard of living? What needs to be done? What percentage of the population has access to water, electricity, so forth and so on. Right, but these are rather innocent ways, frankly, of thinking about what UNDP does. And I'm not saying that this is not true, that indeed this is a part of what they do, and there may be merit in it. Clearly, we need to know what percentage of the population of India or Pakistan or Germany does not still have access to drinking water. This information may be useful for all kinds of purposes. I mean, if you were trying to resolve sanitation, nutritional, and problems of hygiene in a country, well, you would first have to understand what percentage of the people have access to drinking water. But I'm suggesting to you that, like most such enterprises, we have to be a bit wary, and we have to think politically. And in fact, this is one way to understand this course. It's intended to make you think politically, not to think that the process of how we acquire knowledge and the information that comes to us, that there's some kind of innocence about this. There never is, frankly. Right? So now, in the 19th century, the way in which you evaluated civilizations was, and we're interested only in one of these ways, is by judging how this civilization treats its women. Okay, so this is one principal consideration that you have to keep in mind. And as I pointed out to you, that the colonial state and its officials quickly came to the conclusion, a rather convenient conclusion, of course, that India was a country that needed to be put at the bottom of the scale, because in India women were not treated well at all. And we're not going to pause to consider here how well women were treated in England itself, or in France, or in Germany, or anywhere else in Europe at that point in time. Number two, as we move along into the 19th century, for Indian nationalists, the question that comes to their mind as nationalism comes to the fore, in 1885, there's an organization that's going to be founded. It's called the Indian National Congress. Right? And this is an organization that is intended to represent Indians and to eventually increase Indian political participation. And over a period of time, of course, the Indian National Congress will become the preeminent nationalist organization in India. Eventually, it's going to be led by Mohandas Gandhi. Right? And the rest, as I say, is history. Now, what we're saying is that in the last quarter of the 19th century, nationalism has come to the fore. When nationalism has come to the fore, there are Indians, nationalists and Indian thinkers who are putting to themselves the question, why did we as a people get enslaved? Right? Why have we always been under the rule of foreigners? Right? And let's not go over the long terrain of Indian history and ask if this was true or not, whether India was always under colonial rule. Let's just imagine it was. That's what the nationalist thinkers are interested in trying to resolve. Okay? And they're going to come to various conclusions. One of the conclusions they're going to come to is that India is a country that is preeminently spiritual, and therefore it has neglected its material interest. There's one of my favorite examples is this late 19th century Indian writer. His name is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. He's a novelist. He's also a nationalist. And there's a passage in one of his books called Krishna Charitra. Krishna Charitra is the life of Krishna. Right? And Krishna is, as you know, an Indian god. And in this book, or perhaps in some other related work, what he says is very briefly the following. He says that look at the conceit of the Englishman. The Englishman goes on a hunting expedition, and while he's hunting, he sneezes. Right? And then he takes out a handkerchief from his pocket, and he blows his nose into this handkerchief, and then he stuffs this dirty handkerchief into his pocket. Now, there are a number of considerations here. All right, let's not worry about the considerations having to do with hygiene and all of that. What he's interested in here is the following consideration. He says, look at the conceit of the Englishman. How do we even know all of this? We know it because he writes down all of this, and this becomes history. It's a matter of record that this is what this Englishman did on this hunting trip. Okay? That the Englishman, the slightest thing that he does, the slightest little incident in his life, he thinks it's worth recording for posterity. And he says, look at us by contrast. We built great empires as a people, right? Buddhism traveled from India to the rest of Asia. Right? The greatest achievements in mathematics were accomplished in India. And he says, we know nothing about this. We only came to know all about this thanks to the Englishman. Because the Englishman, with his passion for recording things, with his passion for history, he told us about this. But we, in fact, never bothered to record our history, our achievements. We are not interested in the material life. Right? This is how he's setting up the contrast. Okay? That's one end of the question. The second end of this question is, all right, so we were eminently spiritual. Now, can we derive some advantage from that? Clearly, it has hobbled us. It has debilitated us. The fact that we were so spiritually inclined, that we didn't care about the world. And the English said, well, that's very convenient for us because Indians don't really care about things like political governance and administration. We'll govern India for the Indians. Right? But did this spiritual heritage of ours, did it give us some advantages at all? And then Bankim and the others will say, well, yes, there is at least in one respect we can say that it was an advantage for us. What is that? It is a fact that our soul was never contaminated. We've never been contaminated. And the best instance of that is our women. They are the best illustration of the fact that Indian spirituality remains intact. Okay, so as I suggested to you, that one of the things that's going to occur in the late 19th century and then moving into the early 20th century, there's going to be this split between the inner world and the outer world, the home and the world, right? The material world and the spiritual world. And I gave you a schematic, outline of that the other day, right? And this is going to become a matter of concern because in the late 19th century, there's going to be another development in Europe, and it's going to have consequences in India as well. And that is the emergence of what is called the new modern woman. Right? The new modern women. Women who are going to now move into the public sphere. There's concern about that. There's concern about that because of a number of reasons. One, precisely because something of this kind of split has taken place in Britain itself, that women belong to the domestic sphere, the sphere of the home. What happens when they move out into the public sphere, right? Do they become corrupted, right? And as I pointed out to you, that even wearing trousers was considered to be actually quite scandalous, right? Now clearly women are going to make demands. They're going to move into the public sphere because there is obviously demand for women's rights. I mean, at this point they have not been conceded, but clearly there's a demand for it, right? And so one of the things that is going to concern these Indian nationalists is that they're going to say this, that in fact this new modern woman is best exemplified actually in India, because she's going to be a person who will move into the public sphere, but like the lotus flower. You know, the lotus is the quintessential Indian flower, right? It remains absolutely uncontaminated because on the top it's completely beautiful and then it's mud underneath, right? And it will not be stained. It will never be stained, right? This is the idea of the new modern woman, right? So these are the twin legacies, if I may put it this way, that you have to really think about, right? If you're thinking about how does one start to speak about the emergence of women in the public sphere, not just in the diasporic setting, I'm speaking about it in a larger kind of framework. Now, let's look at some historiographic considerations. And you know, one of the pieces that you had by the Dasguptas, you know, the mother and daughter actually, right? You know, women, you know, South Asian women in America. You know, one of the readings that you had for this week. Now, one of the things that they do is they point out that, look, I mean, there is this assumption that the only time Indian women have been liberated is when they actually move out of India and come to places such as the United States. And of course, they suggest that this is an argument that cannot be substantiated. You know? And if you look at India itself, it's very clear that by the early 20th century, moving into the 1920s, 1930s, women had not simply emerged in the public sphere, but they were playing a substantial role in the Indian nationalist movement. One of the reasons why the Indian nationalist movement is much more hospitable than revolutionary movements usually are. Okay? And again, let's not be detained by the consideration whether the Indian nationalist movement was revolutionary or not, because there'll be Marxist scholars who will tell you that, well, it was far from being revolutionary, it was completely bourgeois. You know, in order to be revolutionary, it has to have certain kinds of, you know, qualifications, as it were. Certain aspects of it have to be marked. And one of the things that does not make the Indian nationalist movement revolutionary from this point of view is the repudiation of the idea of violence by Gandhi. Because we know that Gandhi was a rigorous advocate of the idea of mass non-violent resistance. Now, it is precisely because Gandhi had advocated the idea of mass non-violent resistance that the Indian nationalist movement, the freedom struggle, became hospitable to women. That women felt that this was something that they could take part in. You know? And by the way, I should also add as a little footnote that even revolutionary movements in which armed violence is a common aspect of that movement and where women take part. The very classic instance in India is what is called the Telangana movement. And there's been interesting studies that have been done. So this is a movement in the 1940s. It's an armed movement against what we might describe as landlords, in part. That's a partial description of it. Big landlords in the state of Hyderabad in South India. Okay? Now, women took part in it. And if you read women's testimonies, they tell you something that we have seen in virtually all of these so-called revolutionary movements. That as soon as a revolution is over, the women who had picked up guns and ammunition and fought alongside the men, they are told, go back to the kitchen. As soon as the revolution is over. You know, it's like the United States during the period of World War II. You know, there were lots of women who worked in the armaments industry because the men were fighting on the front. And if you read the histories of women's labor in the United States in the 20th century, you know that the moment the war ended in 1945, the women who had worked in these industries, they were all told, go back home. You're not needed anymore. Go back to the domestic sphere. Okay? So we'd have to put a big question mark against these so-called revolutionary movements as well, and the participation of women in the labor force in allegedly advanced industrial countries such as the United States. Now the Indian nationalist movement in the 1920s, 30s, early 40s, there is no question, was very hospitable, relatively speaking, to women. And one of the reasons it was hospitable was because of its emphasis under Gandhi on the idea of non-violent resistance. You know, there are plenty of women's autobiographies from the 20s and 30s that you can read where they talk about how it became possible for them to leave, okay, the shelter of their family home. And the reason they could do so is because their parents said, well, you're moving into the public sphere, you're moving into a sphere which has been defined for us by Gandhi, and Gandhi is a person of a very different character. And since he's leading a mass non-violent movement, you know, we think that it's perfectly safe for you to go into this public sphere. And then in this public sphere, as part of this movement, many of these women are going to take rather important roles. I mean, in the Quit India movement, as it's called, which is the last big surge of resistance to colonial rule before India is going to become free in 1947. So in 1942, you have what is called the Quit India movement. And there are a number of women there who are actually going to be involved in underground activities, revolutionary underground activities, including running clandestine radio stations. I knew one of these women very well when she was still alive. She only died a few years ago, Usha Mehta, you know. And there are women like that who were in fact actually major players. So what is it that we are saying? We are saying, number one, that there are legacies of resistance and activism that women inherit, South Asian women inherit from South Asia itself. It's not the case that the first time they hear of something called resistance or liberation is when they come to the United States or when they go to Britain. Right? Far from that. That there's been a women's movement in India itself in the 1920s going into the modern period. Now, another interesting consideration is that this is a tricky question. You know, I'm going to put it to you in the most cliched form because I get this question, you know, probably 20, 30 times a year, either by email or by students. You know, one of the things that happens commonly these days is high school students sending your professor, they probably send 50 emails to 50 professors saying, I've got this project in world history and I'm doing this segment on India, and could you just take 10, 15 minutes to answer, you know, these 10 questions. How did India become free? Right, I can give you the whole history in 10 minutes. Right? And one of the questions you invariably get from them is, can you please explain why women in India have become prime ministers, right? And why they are goddesses in India, and yet women have a second-class status. Okay? Invariably, you get this question. Right? That on the one hand, that of course, what makes Hinduism distinct from, let's say, Protestant Christianity, right, is the fact that it is in part a goddess-based religion. The goddess. And the goddess is not some theoretical model here. We're talking about millions of people who believe in the worship of the goddess, in the idea of female energy, embodied as Shakti. Shakti is female, primal female energy. Right? And this idea has a deep resonance in many parts of Hindu culture. It's not the only idea that has resonance. There are many ideas, many other ideas have resonance too, and some of those ideas may compete with each other. But this is one idea that certainly has a lot of resonance in Hindu culture. And it is also true that women have risen to positions of political power in India in recent times. We don't have to go back to, you know, Rani of Jhansi, you know, this legendary figure from mid-19th century India who was one of the people who fought the British during what's called the rebellion of 1857-58. Right? Now, that if you look at contemporary Indian politics, right, there have been a number of major Indian women politicians. On the other hand, if you look at, let's say, something like higher education, the number of women proportionately, I'm not talking about whole numbers because whole numbers is obviously going to be bigger in India given the huge population that we have. I'm speaking about proportionately. The number of women in India who do higher degrees in the sciences and mathematics and engineering is much higher than it is in the United States. In the United States, the disciplines and professions are extremely, okay, segregated. And some of them are highly feminized. So if you go into library science, it's almost all women. If you go into computer sciences, it's predominantly male. If you go into theoretical physics, it's predominantly male. Mathematics, engineering. Right? In India, in fact, if you go to Delhi University and you look at the roster of students who are doing PhDs in mathematics and engineering, you find more women than men. Right? So one of the things that they're suggesting, and I'm suggesting, is that, they're not looking into it in such detail, obviously, is that we have to dispense with this idea completely that there's something called Indian culture, and the Indian culture has no space for women at all. Now, to say this is not even remotely to say that there are not constraints on women. Plenty of constraints. And there are plenty of constraints on people who are not women but who are lower castes. And if you happen to be a lower caste woman and you happen to be a Dalit woman, the number of constraints is going to grow dramatically. No question about it. So there are obviously difficulties, obstacles, and liabilities that one would have to think about. But the picture is obviously quite complicated in some respects. Okay? And going back to the question that I posed for you, because we could try to attempt to answer it. We could try to attempt to answer it, and that question was the one that, as I said, I constantly get 25, 30 times a year from various places. Well, India has women prime ministers. In fact, actually, every South Asian country, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all of them have had women prime ministers. And so invariably the question will be, well, how come doesn't that mean that India is politically more advanced than the United States? The US has never had a female head of state, right? No, of course it doesn't mean it's more advanced, not even remotely. And what we would have to do here is we'd have to try to understand a number of different things, right? And one of the arguments that many analysts have made, I'm not sure that this is going to give us all the answers, frankly, but one of the arguments that analysts have made is that most of the women in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh who have risen to the top are women who come from political families, that is, that their husbands or their fathers were exceedingly influential political figures. Exceedingly influential political figures. Sometimes a head of state. A good example would be Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Another very good example, of course, would be Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, whose father, Jawaharlal Nehru, was a Prime Minister of India. But of course, that's true in the United States as well. Now, all you have to do is just look at 20 or 30 women who are important in politics in America and see how many of them actually had either fathers or husbands who were key figures in politics. Take the example of Hillary Clinton. Right? Very good illustration. So here again, we'd have to immediately say that, well, yeah, this analysis may or may not tell us very much. It may tell us that what it does tell us is that in most countries, the rise of women into power has some relationship, in most cases, to the fact that these women are already coming from families that are politically powerful. Okay? And that's not going to explain all the cases. One of the most important Indian women politicians is Mayawati. And in her case, you cannot actually say that, oh, this is the political lineage and we can see exactly how she came into politics. In fact, she comes from a completely obscure background. Completely obscure background. All right? So if we try to give an answer to this question, we will have to really enter into a protracted analysis of how patriarchy works and why within these structures of patriarchy there are all kinds of slippages and gaps that enable some women to rise. Right? Okay? That would be one way to try to attempt to answer this. Now, this is all the backdrop. This is really the backdrop. So when we shift here now to the diasporic context, okay, and again, I want to sort of remind you of something, that the American diasporic context might be quite different. One of the readings that you have for this week, and it's a strictly optional reading, but take a quick look at it if you can. It'll just take you 15 minutes just to breeze through the article. So this is called Kunti's Cry. This is on Indian women indentured laborers and the plantations in Fiji in the late 1800s, really late 1800s and early 1900s. One of the things that is pointed out is that if you look at indentured laborers, and I hope you haven't forgotten them because it's been a few weeks since we talked about them, but they've been an integral part of the story. Okay? An integral part of the story, and for those of you who wrote your paper on Mississippi Masala, and there are about 5 or 6 of you who did that, you should have immediately thought of that context, right? Because it's one way of bringing back that context. And why should you have thought of that? Because the central character in this film is a young woman by the name of Meena. Her father is a fairly central character too, and her father, along with her and his wife, they used to live in Uganda. And you remember what happened to Indians in Uganda in 1972. They're going to be evicted by Idi Amin, and in fact there's a scene in the film where they're shown being expelled along with other Indians, from Uganda. And then he comes over to a place called Greenwood, Mississippi. Okay? Right? I mean, talk about going from a very cosmopolitan background to the most provincial place that you can think of. That's partly what the film is about, by the way. It's a reverse journey from cosmopolitanism to provincialism, because they come to a place called Greenwood, Mississippi, where people cannot distinguish A, between India and Indiana, and B, they cannot distinguish between Asian Indians and Red Indians. Right? Nobody uses that term here, but that's why I'm using it deliberately, right? And there's actually a quip in this film about this, because there's this guy who constantly keeps on saying, "What reservation did you come from? What reservation did you come from?" And then the other motel guy says to him, "How many times have I told you they're not those kinds of Indians?" Right? That's, by the way, one very interesting framework for that film. As an aside, that one of the things the film does is it takes you from a fairly cosmopolitan setting to a really provincial setting. It's a reverse journey. Okay? But we were on the subject of indentured labor. Why did I bring up Mississippi Masala? Because there's a scene in the film, where Meena is going to be invited to have lunch at the home of Demetrius, her new black boyfriend. He's not yet become the boyfriend, he's about to, right? And so she's invited to lunch, and she goes to his home, and her parents are there, and other relatives are there. And then Demetrius' father says, "Yeah, there's one question I have. How come you Indians ended up in Africa?" He's trying to figure that out. And then, of course, what comes out is the history of indentured labor. And then the father or some other character says, "Well, so that's like us folks down here, so you folks were like slaves." And he says, "Yeah, effectively that's what we were." Okay, that's the linkage. And of course, it's the linkage that Indians want to deny. Nobody wants to be considered a slave. Being an indentured laborer might not be very good, right? But you can just hope that most people won't even understand what that means. You say, "Oh, well, yeah, my forefathers were indentured laborers." Well, what is that? And there are these linkages. So now in this particular piece, one of the things that's pointed out in Kunti's Cry, Indian Women on the Plantations, it points out the vulnerability of these women on the plantation. The vulnerability. Right? And it points out that there were all kinds of stereotypes about Indian women in particular. So Indian women who came alone, for example, and there were not very many, but there were some Indian women who came alone, and there could have been any number of circumstances under which they decided to come alone. They could have been fleeing an abusive marriage. Most people think it's unlikely. Would a woman have been thinking about fleeing an abusive marriage in the late 19th century? Well, why not? An abusive marriage is an abusive marriage. Right? And if there's a context in which you can leave, the recruiter or the agent is going from door to door, or is going to a fair where people have come together. The woman has arrived there, she hears of this, she says, "Well, let me take my chances." They might have been women who were going because this was perhaps the only way that they thought they could sustain the family, and they thought they might be going for a very short period of time. There could have been any number of circumstances. But what the articles point out, and it actually quotes these colonial officials, is that invariably an Indian woman going alone was immediately viewed as available, i.e. a prostitute. That was the assumption. That she's a prostitute. She's not attached to anybody, she's available, right? And this is one reason why she's taking the license to go. And then the assumption was that Indian women who are single are promiscuous. They're sexually promiscuous. Right? So if you read that article, the author is citing these colonial officials who are delivering this particular kind of verdict. Okay? That's one context. The context we are looking at is in some ways very different, and in some ways it's not. So if you look at the post-1965 Immigration Act, post-1965 period, what do we find? We find that initially it's going to be men who are going to be coming, something I've spoken about at great length. Largely single men, right? Many of them going to graduate school, getting graduate degrees, and then over a period of time, let's say over half a generation, 15 years, a generation being 30 years roughly, right? That over 15 years, we're going to find that many of these people, these men are going to go back, they're going to get married, they're going to bring their wives, right? And they're going to establish families over here. And then we're going to find that by the early 1980s is something that we're not reading about, because you'd have to get into much more specialized literature, which is exclusively about Indians coming to the United States for higher degrees, sociological studies of that. But there's plenty of evidence to suggest that by the early 1980s, you begin to get single Indian women coming to the United States as well to earn graduate degrees. In many of these cases, there was usually a male member, not in all of these cases, but in many of these cases, there was already a male member of that family who was already present in the United States. The woman might be coming not to be with that male relative, whether usually in this case it would be a brother, an older brother, could be a younger brother, but usually a brother, but there might be an uncle. So they wouldn't be staying with them, because they're coming to do a degree. So you get an offer to do a PhD at University of Arkansas or MIT or whatever the case might be. So that's where you're going to go. But the implication was that there is some male member in the family living in the United States, so if there ever should be a problem, well, she has someone that she can go to. Okay? This was more the pattern, but you do begin to get Indian graduate women coming, and by the late 1980s, early 1990s is actually quite common, and of course is now exceedingly common. I mean, there would still be a preponderance of men over women coming for, let's say, higher degrees. And the number of Indian women coming as undergraduate students would be very, very small. But from very upper crest Indian families, it's not an uncommon phenomenon. And over the nearly 20 years that I've been here at UCLA, I know quite a few Indian women who have come from India as single women to do their undergraduate degrees. Okay, but it's still a very small number. Now, this is not our representative sample for trying to understand, okay, the position of Indian women in the United States. I'm just giving you an illustration, right? Because there are obviously other kinds of considerations, and I think the best window into that, which is why I gave you some of these readings from this book called Our Feet Walk the Sky, which are a set of readings, by the way. The contributors are all women. Okay, so this is a book that was put together by a collective. So these were largely undergraduate, and in some cases a few graduate South Asian students, largely Indian, okay, largely Indian undergraduate women at UC Berkeley, who and others living in the San Francisco, in the Bay Area, who put together this collective, and the collective came out with this book. And what it is basically, sort of testimonies by them, and essays and poems and stories by them, which give some insight into the questions that obviously animate, South Asian women. And these questions obviously have to do with the kinds of things that have been addressed in the films that you've written about, either one film or the other. And particularly those of you who wrote, let's say about let's say The Namesake, okay, right? Or in some cases even in Mississippi Masala, because obviously the question has to do with what is the nature of freedom for South Asian women over in the diaspora context, and how does it really differ from the context in India. And one thing I want to suggest to you is that questions of class are exceedingly important. So for those of you, for example, who wrote your paper on The Namesake, most of you really do not adequately take into consideration the fact that this film is describing not just any Indian immigrant family. It's describing a family that is really highly anglicized for 3 generations. Even before they come to the United States, they've been highly anglicized. How do you know that? You know that because in one of the opening scenes of the film, when this arranged marriage is going to take place between Ashok and Ashima, right? So, she is the prospective bride. She's brought out there, right? Before him and his parents. They have come to sort of, review her. Let me put it to you this way. Okay? And what is she asked to do? She's asked to recite a poem. And what does she recite? She recites a poem that all of us, by the way, learned in school in India. I mean, this was one poem you always read. The Daffodils, right? William Wordsworth. And so she starts to recite the poem, and then when she comes to the last line, immediately what happens? Her prospective father-in-law fills in the last line, because of course he knows it. And then he says, this was my father's favorite English poem. A little scene like that, what does it tell you? It tells you that Ashok, his father, and his grandfather, these are 3 generations of highly anglicized and westernized people. These are not country bumpkins, who are going to be coming to the United States, and they're not going to be running a Dunkin' Donuts in the US. Right? These are people who are going to go to NYU and Yale and the Sorbonne and Oxford and places like that for their higher degrees. Right? Class is a very important consideration in this film. Exceedingly important consideration. So when we talk about how, so-and-so is, Gogol is, feels so liberated, and, the woman that he's going to marry, right, she's actually going to have an affair with a guy in France. Yeah, but there are already people who, these same people back in India would be doing exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. The upper crust in India would have the same liberties that they have over here. So the diaspora context has not been described, frankly, in this case, if you ask me. Right? So we're going to have to essentially nuance this through a consideration of class. Now there are authors such as Chitra Divakaruni. She's very, very popular. 10 years ago, she was the rage here among South Asian women. I remember when I was teaching the diaspora course, like in 2004 or 5, there wasn't a South Asian woman in the class who hadn't read Chitra Divakaruni. So she became well known first through a book called Arranged Marriage, right? Frankly, if you ask me, the stories are very pedestrian. They're very, very pedestrian. They're all about, so a woman works in 7-Eleven store, and it's so dreary. Well, it is dreary. I'm sure it is, working in Walmart or 7-Eleven behind the cash register. And she's thinking about, about marriage, and stories where, she's bothered by the idea of an arranged marriage, and she wants to, exercise her own choice. I mean, that's basically the template, okay? That's essentially the template. I mean, there's nothing really extraordinarily sophisticated, frankly, But these stories obviously touched people, especially young women, because it might seem to have described their own situation, or the kinds of considerations that were important for them. Okay, so that's one way in which you access it. Now, what I want to do very briefly is I want to turn to something like this here for a second, because obviously one of the questions that comes up is, all right, so, given the pressures to marry, and I agree, by the way, that in South Asian families, the pressure to marry is tremendous, because a person who's not married is viewed, frankly, as being incomplete in some ways, So I remember, playing the devil's advocate, like when I was growing up, young, in my late teens, early 20s, I'd have a conversation with my aunt, and she said, well, have you thought about it? I said, I'm not interested in, marrying, If I said, I would say something like that. And she'd immediately say, I'll say it in Hindi first, "Shadi nahi karega to kya karega? Jhak marega." Which means like, okay, so if you're not going to marry, what the hell are you going to do? I mean, just giving you a rough translation, it's like, are you out of your mind? That's the implication, That what else is there to do? This is how you become complete. And then, of course, is this theory that especially men You know, women, see, most people assume that it's only women who are expected to get married. That's actually quite incorrect, if you ask me, in the South Asian context, because the pressure on men is also very great. It is because the assumption is that boys will be boys unless they marry. You see, and then they become men. Then they understand what it means to be responsible, right? So forth and so on. The kinds of arguments that have historically been advanced in most cultures. One of the arguments for marriage, that it's a way of socializing men especially, who otherwise tend to be a bit wild and may even be brutes, you know, but then marriage is going to sort of tame them. It's going to, you know, make them a bit responsible, make them members, active, good social members of a society. And these arguments, by the way, are tacitly present in all cultures. If somebody tells me that this argument is not present in this culture, then I don't think they really have an understanding of American culture either. These are tacitly present in all cultures. They may be spelled out much more explicitly and unashamedly in something like India, in a place like India. Okay? But anyhow, let's just turn very briefly to this site. So it's called Shadi.com. Shadi means, for those of you who are not from South Asian context, of course you understand immediately, Shadi is wedding, right? Marriage. There's also Jeevan Sathi. Jeevan Sathi, we might look at it if we have time. We don't have that much time. So Jeevan Sathi is another site that I recommend to you. Jeevan Sathi means life partner. Sathi is partner, Jeevan is life. Okay, jeevansathi.com, life partner. Bharatmatrimony.com would be another one. So let's just quickly look through these to give you some idea what's going on. Now, if you go to this here, so you know, date of birth, register. This, I wanted to show you this here. Okay, this pull-down menu. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my life. Okay, because when we get down to Hindus, so because remember what the religion, you're supposed to select your religion. Atheist, I like that. They give you the choice. That's a religion. Okay, Bhori, Buddhism, Christianity, and then Christianity they distinguish. I'm not interested here in how they distinguish between Christianity for the moment. What I am interested in is this. That's what I want to show you. Hindu. Since when did all of these become religions? Hindu, Adi, Dravida, Agarwal, Arora. By the way, most of you will have not the remotest idea what these are. These are gotras, actually. These are subcastes like Arora. Arora is the gotra that you belong to, right? So somebody says, what is a gotra you belong to? It's actually the subcaste, if I may put it this way. And that becomes important in considerations of marriage, because if you're going to have an arranged marriage, then obviously the idea is that you find someone from within your community. So this is what I meant when I said, you know, we all think Indian is this huge, you know, a category under which thousands of things are being lumped together, right? And here you see Hindu, Brahmin, and then all of these kinds of Brahmins. By the way, there's a pecking order, you know, between the Brahmins too. Not all Brahmins are equivalent. Some Brahmins are much higher than other Brahmins. Okay, and they'll remind you of that fact too, most of them, right? So then you get Arora, Agarwal, and this is only the beginning, because just see how far down it goes. Okay, you keep on going. These are all the Brahmins. All right, then you get all of the other subcastes. They're not giving all of them, obviously, by the way. And here you see what they're doing is they're confusing many different things now, because this is, the assumption is that in the diaspora context you can take these liberties. So, because if you go to Gujarati, so look under G, Hindu Gujarati, that's not obviously a caste. That's just describing what your linguistic group is, effectively, and what part of India you're coming from. Many of the others, Arora, it's not describing exactly what part of India you're coming from. I mean, you can find Aroras all over North India. But Gujarat means coming from the state of Gujarat or being of Gujarati ancestry, right? Iyer, Iyengar, look at that, okay? So now, we have to logically ask ourselves that when someone is looking for somebody else, do they first go down this drop-down menu and say, let me check out and see how many Iyengars there are. and maybe there isn't enough, of a market here. And let's use that word, because what is it? This is the commercialization. There is a market, right? There's no other way to think about it. Right? And there's going to be an exchange here. So, there are not going to be enough Iyengars. Well, maybe then what I'll do is I'll go to the other groups that are proximate to this, right? Relatively close, yes.
So when it says, above it said Hindu, Brahmin, Gujarati, and then here just Hindu, Gujarati.
Yeah.
Is that the assumption is that those are non-Brahmin?
Yeah,
Gujarati?
that would be it. Or that you don't really care about the caste. You just want a Gujarati. You don't care what kind of Gujarati they are. They could be wheatish. We haven't gone to that yet. One of the skin complexion, wheatish, right? Right? And by the way, in these ads, it used to be very common, especially when they used to appear before. The big line used to be, that would be the answer to your question, okay? The big line would be, caste no bar. Caste no bar. That is that caste is not, okay, and caste no bar. It's not an obstacle. It's not a consideration. So the person is trying to show that they're enlightened, because, frankly, I don't care what caste you come from. Okay? And, of course, 95% of the time, it's a lie. They do care, right? They absolutely care, but they want to show, in principle, that they're progressive, And so they're suggesting that, look, you can be from any caste background, just apply, okay, as it were. Just send me your photo or whatever, if you happen to look like Aishwarya Rai, of course caste is no bar, right? I really couldn't care then in that case, right? That would be the question that the person would be really putting to themselves, okay? We're going to just look at one or two of these. So here, you keep on going down, and notice, by the way, the Patels, they distinguish between the different Patels. Right? They distinguish between the different Patels. This is not a full-blown distinction, because you would need 100 categories there for the Patels alone if you're going to distinguish. Right? This is all Hindu. It just keeps on going down, and then you do get Islam, because they're obviously Indian Muslims, and you get Shia and Sunni, and Islam Bangla. What is that? That's interesting, right? This is a Bangladeshi Muslim. Bangla speaker, but it could also be a reference to Muslims who are Bengalis, rather than Muslims coming from, the Punjab. Okay? Right? So this is why they've made that particular, distinction, and then Jain. So you can see, by the way, it's, in this sense, it's quite ecumenical. They even give you a religion called spiritualism. Okay? Spiritualism, right? So this must have been put up by people who lived in California at one point, okay, and then, of course, so let's just look at one of these here. I just want to show it to you so that you understand what are some of the issues. It's nowhere as hilarious as some of these are, because we're just looking at something that's very conveniently available here. Okay, so view profile. Oh, okay, we have to log in again. Okay. Oops. Okay. So here. So I am on Shadi.com for marriage. Okay. Because the person is indicating very clearly that look, I'm not just here because I want a boyfriend or a girlfriend. This may or may not exclude a phase of experimentation. That would be a matter of negotiation, okay, between this woman and the prospective groom. But she's saying that I'm serious about it. So this is not a LA Weekly ad. Okay, let's just put it that way. All right, there's a big distinction between this and the kind of ad that you might see there. All right, so screen name, gender, age 33. This remark will sound cruel to you, okay, but I'm just telling you what the reality is. If she's 33, prospects are really bad. In this context, really bad. Okay? Right? And so we're going to have to see, let's supposing she was 200 pounds. I mean, then the prospects are a big fat zero. Okay? So obviously there are ways in which you have to disguise. And you could say that, by the way, that's true for any context. Any context that you can think of, wherever, obviously some people will be viewed as more marriageable than others. But we're describing here the Indian context. She's 33, okay? Prospects are not really very good, okay? Marital status, single, have children, no children. This doesn't mean, by the way, that she may not have been married before, but usually they would be expected to say that, right? And there's a specifically Indian word that is going to be used. Does anybody know that? Supposing she had been married, but she had no children. Issueless. So you'll see that in half the ads, where the ad has been given by a woman who has been married before, but is now separated or divorced. Issueless means she has no issue. Issue is a word for children, for offspring. It's not really used in American English, but it's very common in India. Okay? So it'll say very clearly, issueless. All right? It doesn't mean that she doesn't have issues, right? She may have lots of issues, and she's 33, she certainly does. There's no question about that. So you have to know how to read the issueless. Okay? Right? So marital status, have children, no. Religion, caste, Hindu. Spoken language, Hindi. Culture, Punjabi. Right? So she's a Hindi speaker. And she comes from a Punjabi background. So somebody like myself, I'm Punjabi, but I speak mainly Hindi. She doesn't say spoken language Punjabi though, right? So she hasn't really. Okay, education, bachelor. That means she has a bachelor's degree. Profession, nurse. Income level, we'll tell you later. Probably not very good. If it were 100,000, she would have said that. Okay? Now notice, passport and visa type status. See, that's what makes the Indian commercial ad different. Have you ever seen an ad in the LA Weekly? From somebody saying, "Hey, my passport, visa status, American citizen, born in America." Of course not, right? Because this is very important. I mean, half the ads used to say, like for myself, I mean, I'm a green card holder. So supposing I was advertising, right? So green card holder means I'm a permanent resident of the U.S., but not a U.S. citizen. I don't carry an American passport, right? But I'm a green card holder. The green card holder means, my price on the market that I can command, as it were, is higher than anybody else. So supposing I were exactly what I am, okay, of my age, my height, my build, with my income level, right? But I didn't have the green card, my prospects go down a bit. Because green card means a woman sitting in India who wants to come here, I want to marry her, she can come over, okay, without any hindrance or obstacle, other than the usual administrative bureaucratic procedures that are going to be involved, right? So Canadian work visa, but she doesn't say Canadian citizen. So this is an Indian woman, you can tell a lot about her. She doesn't say Canadian citizen. And if she has a Canadian work visa, this means that she's a woman who is of Indian origin, obviously, an Indian passport holder, but she's legally entitled to work in Canada. So she is also giving a hint to people in America, hey, I'm relatively close by, and I'm already somewhat acclimated to North American culture. See, you got to read all of this into it. And anybody who's going through this, they know exactly what to read here. Right? Because she's telling you a lot. It's not simply that, I work legally in Canada. It means I'm living close to America. I'm already familiar with North American culture. And if she were politically astute, she might be even thinking, I live in Canada, so therefore I live in a softer state than America, a bit more liberal probably, Hey, you prospective grooms, keep that in mind, Possible, right? These are possible readings that you can do. Okay, we'll tell you later, city, now you see, St. Albert State, Canada, country born in, country grew up in, nationality there. Okay, I am willing to relocate. So now that what I told you, that is contradicted. She said, no, I'm not willing to relocate. If somebody would have to be, but I can bet you that that's negotiable, okay? All right, and then height, 5 feet 2 inches, and then you give it in centimeters, because the Indians will do it in centimeters, not in feet and inches. You see, so she's catering to both markets. Indians in India, potentially, and Indians living elsewhere. Built, slim, skin tone, fair, okay? Skin tone, fair. Does she use Fair and Lovely cream? I don't know. Okay. Eye color, black. Hair color, black. Okay. Smokes, do not smoke. Drinks, do not drink. You see, these are all, she's saying, look, I don't have any vices. I don't have any vices, Okay? Of course, if you're a man, you might want to say, womanize. No, do not womanize, right? If you're a woman, you don't have to worry about saying, do not fool around with men, okay? Right? Diet, vegetarian. I love this. Lifestyle, modern. What should she have said? Non-modern, traditional. Oh, I believe in living according to norms from 2,000 years ago. Right? It's hilarious, frankly. Right? The minute you start reading these, my wife used to go crazy, because when I used to teach, I would run through some of them and give a running commentary, and she'd say, okay, because you can do a meta commentary on all of these, right? Okay, so now here, let's look at the next interesting part, more details. I am a simple, caring, and composed girl with high human values. What on earth is that, right? I am a simple, simple here is viewed as being good. Because in many contexts, say, oh, this person is so simple. He's a bit of a idiot, frankly, right? Usually the word simple can have that context too. Here she means that, look, I'm a woman without any pretense. She's not saying I'm not a complicated human being. She could be, but I am simple, okay? Caring and composed. I've been reading the Gita since I was a 2-year-old girl. I believe neither in getting too excited nor in getting too depressed, right? Composed. What does composed mean, right? With high human values. No, she should have said, I am a complicated, non-caring girl who likes Hitler, right? High human values, okay? What else is she going to say about herself? Right, so one thing you have to do is when you read this, you just cross out this line. Imagine it doesn't exist. Okay, I'm a very religious person. I'm a very religious person. And then, of course, the religion, right, is going to matter. So she's giving you an indication already that, look, if you don't like the idea of your wife going to the temple or having a little temple at home, or bringing up the children in Hindu values, then you probably should not be sending me your photograph, okay? I believe in strong relationships and long-term commitment. I have done professional nursing diploma from Sir Gangaram Hospital. So there's somebody here like me would know right away, because Sir Gangaram Hospital is like one of the leading super specialty hospitals in India, right? So that means that she's pedigreed. She's pedigreed. She comes from a background of some education, has gone to one of the better hospitals. After completing my diploma, I worked in the same organization for 7 years. Later on in 2000, I did a registered nurse course from Vancouver, as well as completed licensed practical nurse exam. Okay, and she's living in there. Okay, family status, middle class, and let's just see what else she has here. Parents live in India. She lives alone. Let's assume that. Let's hope that. Mother alive, yes. Father alive. Brothers. See, you have to give the whole. Because eventually the person who's going to get married to you, if they come from a somewhat conservative family, they're going to want the lowdown on okay, how many brothers, how many sisters, what does the brother do, what does the sister do, the brother a banker, engineer. Why do you want to know all of that? Because it's what they say in some of these films. You're not simply marrying a person. You're entering into a family. You're not marrying a family, but you're entering into a family. And what other people in the family do reflects on you to some degree. Right? This is the implication. Okay? All right. So age range 32 to 36 years. She's wise enough to know, by the way. This is the, what the age range is, right? What is it referring to? Of prospective grooms. Because remember what her age was? 33. 33. So she doesn't say age range, 18 to 80, right? Or, even 25 to 40. No, she's giving you a fairly, because she figures that, look, likelihood is that the man's going to be a few years older than me, but, some bloke comes along and he's a year younger. Usually there'll be a gap between the woman and the man, and usually the woman is going to be younger, generally, right? 3 to 4 years in India, for example, would be considered to be the norm, Okay, but here she's indicating that, well, if somebody comes along and they're willing to live with a woman who's 1 year older, right? Fine. I can go along with that. Okay? Education, any education. That's the key. That, in a way, she's a little, quote, desperate. Why? Any education, women never marry below them. Almost never. Almost never. If a woman's got a bachelor's degree, she's going to want a husband at least with a bachelor's degree. Men may take and often will take women who are lower. I'm talking about lower in terms of education. If you've got 100 men with PhDs in mathematics, not all of them are going to demand a wife who's got a PhD. Of course not. Right? Many of them will marry women who have lower educational standards. And that's true, by the way, not just in Indian culture. In American culture, it would be the norm too. Women usually will not marry below themselves. Usually. They would, particularly when it comes to educational status. They marry men who are going to be hired. She says any education. You got to link that to the 33. Absolutely, because prospects are going down. Now you can't be that picky, frankly. Okay, all right, we're going to have to stop here because I want to return your papers to you, and I want to say a few things about the papers. What I did, by the way, today, this morning, so for those of you who've checked your email, you would have seen it already. I emailed you all, let me see, where is it? A note, a very long note on Bend It Like Beckham. And even if you did not write your paper on this film, you should read that note. Okay, so as I mentioned, more than half of you actually wrote on this film. And I had in some of the remarks that I'd made in class on, let me just shut this off. In some of the remarks that I had made on Tuesday, I had discussed actually the film. So I had suggested to you that, look, there are different kinds of interpretive frameworks. And one of the frameworks that I had suggested to you, just as a suggestion. Now, I'm not saying anybody should necessarily have done it that way, but just to give you an idea of what are the kinds of interpretive possibilities when it comes to film, that I had suggested that one framework is to look at the idea of the center and the periphery. Why is it that all the major characters in some ways are at the periphery? And when I say periphery, I mean the periphery to the center. What would center of what, you would say? That's a question you might want to logically ask. That what is British identity? The center of British identity would have been a white Anglo-Saxon male. This is what it meant to be British until relatively recently. And this is partly what this film is about. It's contesting this whole idea of what is British identity. Who can claim to be British? Why shouldn't just to claim to be just as much British as young white Anglo-Saxon males who frankly thought that they were really the center of what it meant to be British, and particularly English. So British itself was viewed as the center of being British meant being English. And that's why Joe is at the margins too. Because who is he? He's Irish. And it's not simply that he's a minority. That's not going to be enough. He's Irish. What is the significance of? Significance of that is both the Irish and the Indians were oppressed by the English. Before England colonized India, what did it colonize? It colonized Ireland. Right? That's what it means. Because when Jess tells Pinky, her sister, that look, he's Irish. And Pinky says, they're all the bloody same. Right? You see, that's another thing the film is doing. It's telling you very subtly, very gently but subtly, there is a tendency on both sides to homogenize the other. Yeah, they all look the same to me, English, Irish, Welsh, Gaelic, they all look the same to me. Right? That's what she's saying, Pinky. And of course, the English was saying Paki, Bangladeshi, Bengali, Gujarati, Tamil. Hey, man, they're all Pakis. Isn't that it? There is a tendency on both sides. And of course, that's one reason why Jess is going to take offense, because there's this match going on, and at one point, the opposing person on the opposing team says, you Paki. By the way, you could do your whole paper on that one comment. Why could you do your whole paper? Because so much is contained there. It's not simply the fact that of course, first thing, the entire community is being homogenized. No question about it. And she's going to take offense. But the homogenization is not you Indian, it's you Paki. Now that makes it worse. Why does it make it worse? Because being a Pakistani in Britain means you're also a Muslim. And this means a liability. A liability. Remember, I had read you an article, the Patel versus Rasool, that Indians who are non-Muslim are 10 times likely to do better than Muslims from Pakistan. 3 times better, likely to do 3 times better than even Indian Muslims. Right? Huge gap. So being Pakistani, being a Muslim, this is a big liability in comparison to being an Indian. And then, of course, a homogenization of the community. All of this is going on in that particular comment. Okay? And so we were saying, when we say center and periphery, well, periphery of what? What is a center? And you could say that in part what this film is about is it's really about what it means to be British. It is grappling with that question. How is Britain really changing? Who lays claim to be British? Right? Are the English necessarily more British than a third generation Indian living in Britain? Why should they not be viewed just as British as a white male whose family for 10 generations has been living in England? That's one framework. Okay? But even the framework that most of you used, okay? I mean, I would say the bulk of the people who wrote this paper, in fact, the other papers too, you take something called Indian culture, and then you take something called Western culture. Okay? And the assumption throughout most of these papers really is that Indian culture is traditional. Some of you actually said traditional Indian culture, which is almost redundant, because then in the paper itself it becomes clear that when you say Indian culture, you mean traditional culture. And then something called Western culture, which is implicitly supposed to be modern. Okay? Now I think you'd have to question that. I mean, let's take one institution which is so central to British life. What is that institution? Anybody make a guess, quick. Tea. Well, but tea, they drink more tea in India than they do in Britain. What? Huh? Football, yeah, football, but something that is particular. Monarchy. The whole, what was the founding of America about? There was a decision taken by the so-called founding fathers. I won't get into the mythology of the founding fathers. That's another lecture. Okay? But a decision taken that you're going to rid yourself of the institution of monarchy, wasn't it? Isn't that what it means to be a republic? And that this was going to be a modern republic. Now Britain still has this antiquated institution called the monarchy, and if I started describing the antics of this monarchy, we'd be here for a whole week. Because it's frankly an absurd, ridiculous institution, and it's definitely has a history going back 1,000 years. Right? So why, if Britain is so modern, do they persist with this ludicrously archaic institution called the monarchy? India, on the other hand, does not have a monarchy. India does not have a monarchy. Right? So if we take the monarchy as an example, shouldn't we be saying, by the way, that India is more modern than Britain, at least politically speaking? At least they have the wisdom to get rid of the queen and, a bunch of her sons, half of whom are incompetent, right? And simply are going to inherit some throne and, 500 million pounds along with that. I mean, think about it. You know how much it costs to maintain this institution called the monarchy? Of course, it generates revenue because you've got all these Americans who go there and they watch the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, you know, right? I mean, it's comical. The whole thing is really comical, frankly. This institution called the monarchy. Let's take something else, okay? Let's take naming, because it's important, after all, in a film called The Namesake that some of you wrote about, right? Let's take the question of naming. Most people assume, okay, that one of the ways in which India is traditional is that in India it's unthinkable that a woman would not take on her husband's name after she gets married. Frankly, that's completely wrong. Because in India, there was no homogeneous way at all in which names worked. This idea that a woman takes on her husband's name after she gets married is a distinctly Western idea that is then brought over to India. And now everybody in India assumes that we've had it in India for 2,000 years. There are still a whole number of people that I know personally who only go by one name. They don't even use surnames. You can't do that in America. You can't even get a passport. You know, take this Indian politician that I was mentioning to you half an hour ago, Mayawati. That's the only name she goes by. She doesn't have any other name. You can speak to 1,000 specialists in Indian politics and history and nobody will be able to tell you if she has a surname or not, because that's the only name she goes by, Mayawati, and it's her legal name. It's her legal name. This standardization, homogenization, all of this came to us, frankly, through the West. I'll give you another illustration. Famous Indian cartoonist, R.K. Lakshman, okay, with a very famous brother, R.K. Narayan, okay, because in South India, the names are done completely differently than they are done. So my name, for example, is more like a name you would encounter here. So you could say, yeah, Vinay is the first name, Lal is, you know, the surname, and I should say, by the way, 3 or 4 of you misspelled my name, but that's not a precondition for passing the course, or for, you know, I mean, you know, I remember taking a course on Nietzsche when I was an undergraduate, because Nietzsche, people usually change the E and the I. And the professor said, one of the preconditions for passing this course on Nietzsche is you've got to know how to spell the name Nietzsche, okay? Well, that's not a precondition for passing this course. You don't have to know how to spell my name, but, okay, so here we've got R.K. Narayan, right? Lakshman is the first name. It's the first name, but it goes at the end. Narayan is the first name. They're brothers. R stands for the name of the father. K stands for the name of the village. There are so many ways in which we do this in India, right? But you see, if you make the assumption that, oh, in India, women all take the last names of their husbands, no, they don't. My wife, for example, did not. And she's as Indian as you can get, you know? Born and raised in Delhi and didn't come to the US until her 20s, right? So, this idea that Indian culture is to tradition as Western culture is to modernity, this runs through most of the papers. But you cannot just assume that and take it for granted. You've got to start looking into something like this. Okay, now I'm not going to read out the whole note because it's a long note. It's, you know, and it gives you some ideas about how you might start exploring the film. One last comment. The fact that this is all done on the soccer field. A couple of you picked up that point. That's important. Because soccer is the most internationalized, globalized, multicultural sport in the world. In the world. And there's nothing that comes even remotely close to it. You see? Okay? And there are ironies here. At the very end, they go on a scholarship, a football scholarship to America, where football doesn't even mean what it means in the rest of the world. Because when you say football here, it means, you know, some jocks playing some game that nobody else in the world understands. That's what it means here. Right? So you think about it, you know, how ironical is it? You want to go on a football scholarship, I would think, well, maybe they ought to have gone to Italy or France, or even stay in England, which is where Football drives a passion. You read the New York Times 4 days ago had a 3-page article in the sports section about English football. I mean, this drives people crazy there, like what you won't believe. You know, and English football fans were notorious because they used to go around the entire continent. You know, they would follow their team, and if their team lost, I mean, you know, the whole city would hunker down, you know, because you never knew what these guys were going to do. They'd go out on a rampage on the streets and, you know, throw bottles around and, you know, destroy buses and police cars. I'm not exaggerating. They're notorious. Okay? So think about these things. All right, let me give your papers back to you.